The spotlight swept across the stage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, April 1962. The Copa Room was packed as always, 2,000 people waiting to see the Rat Pack do what they did best. Frank Sinatra stood center stage, finishing Fly Me to the Moon. Dean Martin was leaning against the piano with his usual drink. Sammy Davis Jr. had just finished a tap routine that brought the house down. Joey Bishop was cracking jokes from the side, and Peter Lawford, handsome and charming in his tuxedo, was waiting for his moment. Peter took the microphone, flashing that movie star smile. The audience settled in, ready to laugh. Peter had a way of telling stories that made everything sound glamorous and fun. "You know," Peter said, his British accent making even casual words sound sophisticated. "I was at the White House last week visiting my brother-in-law. The president sends his regards to all of you." The audience chuckled. Peter Lawford, married to Patricia Kennedy, the president's sister, loved dropping these little references. It was his currency, his connection to power. Peter continued, oblivious to what was happening behind him. "Jack told me the funniest story about—" He never finished the sentence. Frank Sinatra set his microphone down on its stand, not dropped, not thrown, just placed it there with careful, deliberate control. Then he turned and walked off the stage. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. The smile froze on Peter's face. Dean straightened up from the piano, his easy demeanor vanishing. Sammy stopped mid-step. The audience shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was part of the act. Peter stood there holding the microphone, confusion washing over his features. "Frank?" Peter called toward the wings. No answer. Dean quickly grabbed a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman needs a quick break. Let's keep this party going, shall we?" His voice was light, but his eyes were worried. What the audience didn't know, what Peter was only beginning to understand, was that Frank Sinatra had just ended a friendship. Right there on stage, in front of 2,000 people, Frank had made a decision that would last for the next 30 years. Peter Lawford had made one joke too many, and Frank Sinatra never forgave him. To understand what happened that April night, you need to understand who Peter Lawford was and what he meant to Frank Sinatra. More importantly, you need to understand what happened 1 month earlier, the betrayal that had left a wound so deep that even the smallest touch made it bleed again. Peter Lawford was born in London in 1923 to a distinguished British military family. He came to Hollywood in the 1940s and became a contract player at MGM, getting small roles in big films. Peter was handsome, charming, well-spoken, but his career never quite took off the way he hoped. He was always the supporting player, never the star. In 1954, Peter married Patricia Kennedy, sister of the young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. Suddenly, Peter Lawford wasn't just another actor. He was connected to one of America's most powerful families. He was somebody. Frank Sinatra met Peter in the early 1950s, and they became friends. Frank liked Peter's easygoing nature, his British humor, his lack of ego. Peter wasn't trying to compete with Frank or control him. He was just happy to be around. When Frank started performing regularly in Las Vegas with Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., he brought Peter into the group. Peter became the 5th member of what the press started calling the Rat Pack. But Peter brought something else to the group: access. Through Peter, Frank got close to John F. Kennedy, and Frank, who'd spent his entire life fighting to be respected by the establishment, saw an opportunity. If he could befriend a Kennedy, if he could help elect a president, then Frank Sinatra would finally be more than just an entertainer. He'd be a man of influence, a man who mattered in the rooms where real power lived. Frank threw himself into Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign with an intensity that surprised even his closest friends. He organized fundraisers, he performed at rallies, he used every connection he had to marshal support, and Peter was the bridge that made it all possible. Peter arranged meetings, Peter made introductions, Peter brought Frank into the Kennedy orbit. When Kennedy won, Frank believed his investment had paid off. The president-elect personally thanked Frank for his help. There were photos of them together, smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. Frank started making plans. Kennedy would visit him in Palm Springs. They'd be friends, real friends. But there was a problem Frank didn't see coming. Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother and soon-to-be attorney general, had never liked Frank. Bobby was moralistic, straight-laced, deeply concerned with appearances, and Bobby knew about Frank's reputation. The rumors of connections to organized crime figures, the photos of Frank with men like Sam Giancana. Bobby didn't believe these were innocent acquaintances. Bobby believed Frank was a liability. Throughout 1961, Bobby put pressure on his brother. The president couldn't be seen with Frank Sinatra. It would give ammunition to their enemies. It would taint the administration. The president needed to distance himself. Peter Lawford knew this was happening. He was at family dinners where Bobby made his case. He heard the president waver, torn between friendship and political necessity. And Peter knew he was caught in the middle. On one side was Frank, his friend, the man who'd brought him into the Rat Pack and made him feel like he belonged. On the other side was the Kennedy family, his wife's family, the source of his status and identity. In March 1962, the conflict came to a head. President Kennedy was scheduled to visit California. The original plan was for him to stay at Frank's compound in Palm Springs. Frank had spent months preparing. He'd renovated guest rooms, installed new security systems, built a helicopter landing pad specifically for the president's arrival. Frank had spent over $200,000, but it wasn't about the money. It was about what it represented. The President of the United States staying at Frank Sinatra's home. The ultimate validation. 1 week before the president was due to arrive, Peter Lawford got a phone call from Bobby Kennedy. "Peter, the president can't stay at Frank's place. The associations are too problematic. He'll stay at Bing Crosby's instead." Peter felt sick. Bing Crosby, a Republican, someone who hadn't lifted a finger to help Kennedy get elected. The insult couldn't have been clearer. "Bobby, Frank's been preparing for months. This will destroy him." "I don't care," Bobby said coldly. "This is decided. You need to tell him." Peter tried to find another way. He called other Kennedy associates. He tried to reason with the president directly, but the decision was final, and Peter was the one who had to deliver the message. He called Frank the next day. His hands were shaking as he dialed. "Frank, there's been a change in plans. The president's schedule has shifted. He won't be able to stay at your place." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Frank's voice, quiet and controlled. "Where is he staying?" Peter hesitated. This was the worst part. Bing Crosby's place. Frank hung up without another word. What happened next became legend in Hollywood. Frank went to Palm Springs and personally demolished the helicopter pad he'd built, took a sledgehammer to the concrete himself, destroying it in a rage that was part fury and part heartbreak. Dean Martin drove out to see Frank that evening. He found Frank sitting in the rubble, exhausted and broken. "They used me, Dean," Frank said. "I gave them everything, and they threw me away like garbage." Dean knew better than to offer platitudes. He just sat with his friend in the desert dusk. Peter tried to call Frank repeatedly over the next few days. Frank wouldn't take his calls. Peter sent messages through Dean, through Sammy. Frank ignored them all. Finally, after a week, Frank called Peter back. "I know you were just the messenger," Frank said. His voice was tired. "You were caught in the middle. I get it." Peter felt a wave of relief. "Frank, I'm so sorry. I never wanted." "I know. It's not your fault. It's theirs. But Peter, I need you to understand something. This hurt, and I'm not over it." "I understand. Whatever you need. I need time. Can you give me that?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." Over the next few weeks, Frank slowly started coming around. He was still cold toward Peter, but he was talking to him. They were performing together at the Sands. Things weren't the same, but maybe they could heal. Maybe the friendship could survive. That's what Peter believed. What Peter didn't understand was that Frank's wound was still raw, still open, and it wouldn't take much to tear it wide again. When April 18, 1962, the Rat Pack was scheduled for their regular show at the Sands. Frank arrived at the hotel that afternoon in a dark mood. Dean noticed immediately. "You okay, Polly?" "I'm fine. Let's just do the show." But Dean knew Frank well enough to recognize when fine meant anything but. Still, the show had to go on. That evening, they all gathered backstage. Frank, Dean, Sammy, Joey Bishop, and Peter, the usual pre-show energy. Sammy was warming up his voice. Dean was having his first drink. Joey was running through his opening jokes. Peter was in a good mood. He'd been at a Kennedy family gathering the previous weekend, and he had some funny stories, harmless anecdotes, the kind of thing audiences loved, celebrity gossip about the most powerful family in America. "I've got some great material tonight," Peter told Dean. "The crowd's going to love it." Dean, who had better instincts than Peter, felt uneasy. "Maybe keep it light, Peter. Frank's in a weird mood." "It's all light. Trust me." The show began with Frank singing, "I've Got You Under My Skin." The audience was electric as always. Dean joined him on stage, made some jokes, got big laughs. Sammy did a dance number that brought the house down. Everything was going perfectly. Then it was Peter's turn. He took the microphone with confidence. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful crowd tonight." The audience applauded. Peter smiled, soaking it in. "You know, I have a unique perspective on current events. You see, I was at the White House just last week." The audience murmured with interest. Peter continued, not noticing Frank's expression beginning to change. "My brother-in-law, the president, he's a funny guy. He told me this great story about." Frank's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, slowly clenched into fists. Dean saw it happening. He tried to catch Peter's eye, tried to signal him to stop, but Peter was in his element, enjoying the attention, oblivious to the danger. "Jack said to me, 'Peter, you need to tell Frank.'" That was it. The moment. Peter invoking the president by his first name, casually dropping Kennedy into a story on Frank's stage, reminding everyone in the room of his connection to power, the power that had rejected Frank. Frank walked to the microphone stand and carefully, deliberately, set his microphone down. The action was so controlled, so precise, that it was more frightening than if he'd thrown it. Then Frank turned and walked off the stage. The band kept playing for a few confused measures before trailing off. Peter stood there, the smile dying on his face. "Frank," he called toward the wings. Nothing. Dean moved fast. He grabbed a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman needed to take a quick break, but the show goes on. Sammy, Joey, let's give them something special." Sammy and Joey launched into an improvised number, trying to cover the awkward moment. Dean joined in, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Frank, about the look on Frank's face before he walked off. Backstage, Frank was in his dressing room, pouring himself a drink. His hands were steady, but his face was stone. There was a knock at the door. Peter pushed it open, his expression confused and worried. "Frank? What happened? Are you okay?" Frank didn't turn around. "Get out, Peter." "Frank, I don't understand. What did I do?" Now, Frank turned. His eyes were cold. "What did you do? You stood on my stage in front of my audience, and you bragged about being at the White House, about being with the Kennedys, the same people who told you I wasn't good enough to host the president." Peter's face went pale. "Frank, it was just a story. I wasn't trying to." "You weren't trying to what? Rub it in my face? Remind me that you're connected and I'm not? That you get to go to the White House while I get thrown out like trash? That's not what I meant at all." "Then what did you mean, Peter?" Frank's voice rose. "Explain to me how that was supposed to make me feel. Explain how you thought that was okay." Peter stammered. It was entertainment. A funny story. I thought, you didn't think." "That's the problem. You never think about anyone but yourself." The door opened again. Dean Martin stepped in, followed by Sammy. They'd left Joey to finish the show. "Frank," Dean said calmly, "let's talk about this after the show. The audience." "I don't care about the audience," Frank cut him off. "I'm done. I'm done with this show. I'm done with him." He pointed at Peter. Sammy tried to intervene. "Frank, man, Peter made a mistake, but we all make mistakes. Remember when I—" "This is different, Sammy," Frank said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "This isn't a mistake. This is Peter showing me who he is. And who he is a Kennedy. Not one of us. A Kennedy." Peter's voice cracked. "Frank, please, we've been friends for years. Don't do this." Frank looked at Peter for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was final. "We were friends. Past tense. But you made your choice when you married into that family. You chose them, and they used both of us. But at least I know where I stand now, and you need to know where you stand too." "Frank, you're out, Peter. Out of the Rat Pack. Out of my shows. Out of my life. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear from you. We're done." The room went silent. Peter looked at Dean, at Sammy, desperate for someone to intervene. Dean's face was pained, but he said nothing. Sammy looked at the floor. "Frank." Peter tried one more time, his voice barely a whisper. "Please don't do this. Get out." Peter stood there for another moment, then turned and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot. Dean let out a breath. "Frank, that was harsh. He deserved it." Did he? He was caught in the middle. The Kennedys put him in an impossible position. Frank shook his head. He had a choice. He could have stood with me. Instead, he stood with them, and then he came here and rubbed my face in it. I'm supposed to just smile and take it? No, Dean said quietly, but you're also supposed to forgive. Isn't that what friends do? Friends don't betray each other. He didn't betray you, Frank. He made a stupid joke. A thoughtless, stupid joke. But it wasn't betrayal. Frank looked at Dean with eyes that held more pain than anger. That's where you're wrong, Dean. It was betrayal. Because that joke told me he doesn't understand. He doesn't get how much they hurt me. And if he doesn't get that, then we were never really friends. From that night on, Peter Lawford was erased from Frank Sinatra's life. Upcoming Rat Pack films that had Peter in the cast were reshot with other actors. Peter's phone calls went unanswered. Messages through mutual friends were ignored. It was as if Peter had ceased to exist. Peter tried everything. He wrote letters. He showed up at places where he knew Frank would be. He sent gifts. Nothing worked. Frank had made his decision, and Frank Sinatra never reversed course. Dean Martin tried to play peacemaker. He'd see Frank and make a case for forgiveness. Frank, Peter's suffering, his career's falling apart. The Kennedys have distanced themselves from him too. He's lost on all sides. That's not my problem. Frank, come on. He made a mistake, one stupid mistake. Are you really going to end a friendship over one bad joke? Frank looked at Dean with an expression that was almost pity. Dean, you're too forgiving. That's your nature. But me, I can't forget, and I won't forgive. Peter showed me who he is. I'm just believing him. Even Sammy tried. Frank, Peter calls me sometimes. He's really broken up about this. Then maybe he should have thought about that before he opened his mouth. The years passed. The Rat Pack continued without Peter, bringing in other performers to fill the gap. But those who'd been there from the beginning said it was never quite the same. Peter had been part of the chemistry. His absence left a hole. Peter's career spiraled downward. Without the Rat Pack, without Frank's protection and influence, Peter struggled to get work. He turned to alcohol. His marriage to Patricia Kennedy fell apart. By the 1970s, Peter was broke, struggling with addiction, a shadow of the man he'd once been. And still, Frank wouldn't relent. In 1984, Peter Lawford was diagnosed with liver cancer. He was dying. Friends who still cared about him reached out to Frank. Frank, Peter's in the hospital. He doesn't have long. Please go see him. Let him die in peace. Frank's answer was always the same. No. Dean tried one last time. Frank, he's dying. Whatever he did, don't you think he's paid for it? Can't you find it in yourself to forgive him? Frank looked at his oldest friend and said quietly, "Some things can't be forgiven, Dean, and this is one of them." Peter Lawford died on December 24th. He was 61 years old. His funeral was small. Some of his old Hollywood friends attended. Dean Martin was there, sad and angry at the waste of it all. Frank Sinatra did not attend. He sent no flowers, no message, nothing. When reporters asked Frank about Peter's death, Frank's response was brief. "I have nothing to say about that." Years later, after Frank had died, Dean Martin did an interview where he was asked about the Peter Lawford situation. Did Frank ever regret cutting Peter out? Dean thought for a long time before answering. "I don't think Frank knew how to regret. He made decisions, and he lived with them. But I'll tell you this, I think Frank was wrong. Peter made a mistake. A thoughtless, stupid mistake. But he didn't deserve 30 years of exile. He didn't deserve to die alone and broken, while his old friend refused to even acknowledge his existence." Why do you think Frank couldn't forgive him? Because to Frank, what Peter did wasn't just a bad joke. It was a reminder of the deepest wound Frank ever had, the Kennedy betrayal. Frank had invested everything, his time, his money, his heart, into helping Kennedy become president, and they threw him away, told him he wasn't good enough. And then Peter, who'd been the bridge to all of that, stood on Frank's stage and casually mentioned being at the White House, like it was nothing, like Frank's pain didn't matter. Frank couldn't forgive that, not because Peter was malicious, but because Peter was oblivious, and sometimes thoughtlessness hurts more than cruelty. The story of Peter Lawford and Frank Sinatra is a tragedy, not the kind with heroes and villains, the kind with flawed people making human mistakes and paying prices that far exceed the crime. Peter wasn't evil, he was weak. Caught between two powerful forces, he tried to please both and ended up losing everything. His joke on stage wasn't meant to hurt Frank. It was just Peter being Peter, name-dropping, trying to seem important. He didn't understand how deep Frank's wound went, and that lack of understanding cost him everything. Frank wasn't a monster for cutting Peter out. He was a man in pain who'd been betrayed by people he trusted. The Kennedy rejection had shattered something in Frank, and Peter's joke, innocent as it might have been, felt like salt in that wound. Frank protected himself the only way he knew how, by cutting off the source of pain. But the cost was steep. Frank lost a friend. Peter lost everything. And the Rat Pack, that legendary group of performers who defined cool for a generation, fractured. They kept performing, kept making movies, but the magic was gone. The spontaneity, the joy, the sense that these were genuine friends having fun, it faded, because friendship requires forgiveness. It requires understanding that people make mistakes. It requires the grace to look past a thoughtless moment and see the whole person. Frank couldn't do that. And maybe that was his greatest weakness. For all his talent, all his success, all his legendary toughness, Frank Sinatra couldn't let go of his pain. Peter Lawford made one joke, a stupid, thoughtless joke about being at the White House, and it cost him 30 years of friendship, his career, and ultimately his dignity. He died alone, broke, and forgotten by the man who'd once called him brother. That's the real story behind the Rat Pack's end. Not a dramatic falling out, not a betrayal worthy of a movie, just one man making an innocent mistake and another man unable to forgive. Just human frailty on both sides, playing out in the cruelest possible way. The night Frank walked off that stage in April 1962, he thought he was protecting himself, asserting his dignity, making clear that he wouldn't be disrespected, and maybe he was right to be hurt. Maybe Peter should have known better. But in protecting himself, Frank lost something precious. A friendship. An imperfect, complicated friendship with a flawed man, but a friendship nonetheless. And Peter lost even more. He lost his place in the Rat Pack, his career, his identity, and in the end, he lost his life to the slow poison of regret and self-destruction. Two men, one joke, 30 years of silence, and a lesson that echoes across the decades, that loyalty is precious, that words matter, that pain can make us cruel, and that sometimes the inability to forgive hurts us more than the original wound ever could.